More than half a century has passed since the most standout space success of mankind. The first satellite, the first man in orbit, and the moon landing. Each of these events has left an incredible massive footprint in history. It is difficult to imagine the modern life without a space program, GPS, the internet, television. All this is mainly based on hundreds of extremely complex devices that orbit the Earth. But we perceive this not as a miracle, but as everyday reality. But that wasn't the case in the middle of 20th century. Back then, conquest of space was a matter of national prestige, not just the accomplishment of some practical tasks. Today, I want to tell you how the American program Apollo appeared, why no expense was spared on it, and why so many people refused to believe that Americans were on the moon. So let's see how come the USA could successfully send the astronauts so far from the Earth, and why don't they fly there anymore.
But why some say the moon? Why choose this as our goal? We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
So how did all this begin? How was it possible more than 60 years ago to not only send a man to the moon, but bring him back? I mean, especially with those old computers. Well, the reason for NASA and Apollo birth was war, specifically Cold War, between the USA and Soviet Union. The two nations were competing in a race for space. In 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite in orbit, Sputnik 1. The American government was absolutely shocked to see this. The whole nation was shocked. The rumors were spread out about the oncoming destruction of the USA. The priests predicted the end of the world. Ordinary Americans perceived the satellites not just as a simple piece of iron in space, but rather a flying threat. If you ask why, well, it's 1957 and the Soviets were outsiders. Only 2 months later, January 31, 1958, America was able to send their own satellite, Explorer 1. The very minimum was achieved. The United States finally became a space power. Obviously, that was not enough. The USA needed not only to catch up with the Soviets, but to overtake them. So this time, the President Eisenhower had to change something. The very first step was the creation of NASA, to gather all the scientists and developers in one place. 3 years later, in 1961, America got another hit. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first person to go to space on Vostok 1. This was a big strike for Americans. Just imagine, the only person to leave the Earth was a Soviet. A month later, America sent their own man to space, Alan Shepard, but they're still lagging behind the Soviets. John Kennedy felt that the national pride of Americans had taken a significant blow. He tried to find an unifying idea that would uplift everyone and restore the status of USA leading country. But how can we restore the status? What would be the super task, the breakthrough to put Soviets behind? The decision was made. Moon landing. So was the Apollo program born. Why was it called Apollo? It was called after the Greek god of light, music and sun, by NASA manager, who later said, "I was naming the spacecraft like I'd name my baby." NASA was committed. Between 1963 and 1967, numerous tests were conducted, but none of them involved human participants. By the end of the 1967, it was planned to launch Apollo 1 with 3 cabin crews. But during the test on Earth in January, the cabin caught fire, killing all astronauts. After this hardship, NASA maintained its determination, continuing further testing. Apollo 4, 5 and Apollo 6 were all unmanned missions. On October 11, 1968, Apollo 7 was launched, the first manned mission after the tragedy. It was an 11-day Earth orbital flight, which tested the systems, and it was successful. 2 months later, December 1968, another crew mission was launched to orbit the moon and back to the Earth. They took the pictures that some argue inspired contemporary environmentalism and showed just how close we were to reaching the moon. 3 months later, March 1969, Apollo 9 was launched to test the spacecraft that was going to land on the moon. 2 months after that, in May 1969, was the Apollo 10 mission. 3 astronauts had to do almost everything for practice that was supposed to be done on Apollo 11 mission, except for actually landing on the moon. And this was another success. The speed and commitment of NASA is just incredible. There was no way they were going to lose the race to the Soviets. After the crew got ready, they spent more than 400 hours on the test ship. About 40% of the time was spent on exercise on board with the computers. Everything was going accordingly to the plan. The worries of the director of NASA were mainly caused by just one thing: the problem with the launch from the moon. If for some reasons the engine fails, then there was simply no plan B. But there was nothing to be done. The risk was considered justified, because so far there was no serious accidents. And finally, the X-day has come. On 16 July 1969, the Apollo 11 mission was launched. It became the main world sensation of the year. Everyone knew what kind of flight it would be and when. No special secrecy was there either. The atmosphere for something grandiose was also supported by hundreds of journalists from dozens of countries. 3 heroes were part of the mission. Commander Neil Armstrong, the pilot of the lunar module Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and the pilot of the command module Michael Collins. Why is that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong are so popular but Michael Collins is not? I will tell you later in the video. The spacecraft Apollo 11 reached Earth orbit in less than 10 seconds. Then they made about 1.5 revolutions around the Earth, after which they were given the permission to start the translunar injection, taking the spacecraft out of the Earth's orbit and towards the Moon's orbit. All these events took place within the first 5 hours of launch, but to actually reach the Moon took several days. Astronauts were in the spacecraft where they slept, ate, and took many pictures. 19 July 1969, after traveling for about 400,000 kilometers, the Apollo 11 spacecraft reached the Moon's orbit, where it was supposed to split into two. The command and service module separated from the lunar module. Michael Collins was in the command module, nicknamed Columbia. The lunar module, on the other hand, had Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and it was nicknamed Eagle. The thing is that the command and service module was tasked to remain in the Moon's orbit, and only the lunar module was going to land on the Moon. It meant that only Armstrong and Aldrin had the chance to step on the Moon, and not Michael Collins. Perhaps this is the reason why not many people know Michael Collins. Even though he was a part of the Apollo mission, he did not step on the Moon. But even so, Michael Collins' part in the mission was perhaps one of the most important, because the lunar module was supposed to be reattached back to the service and command module. Without Michael Collins, Armstrong and Aldrin could not return safely. On the evening of 19 July, Apollo 11 was behind the Moon according to the plan and began slowing. The astronauts took their time. They circled around the Moon for about a day to aim better. Finally, it was the time Neil and Buzz were supposed to say goodbye to Michael Collins. Before the docking hatch closed behind them, Michael shook their hands and said goodbye. I'll be waiting for you in 30 hours. The culmination of a long-term pace of the program was beginning. At about 8 p.m. the lunar module was going to land on the Moon. Exactly at 8 and 10 p.m. alarms went off, 12:01 and 12:02. Neither Armstrong or Aldrin knew the meaning of this alarm. The processing system of the guiding computer of Apollo 11 was overloaded. It was fortunate that the Apollo system was designed by Margaret Hamilton. Margaret designed the program in such a way that software's most important jobs would interrupt less important ones. During the overload, the software restart programs allowed only the highest priority jobs to be processed, including the program necessary for landing. The priority displays gave the astronauts a choice to land or not to land. With only 5% fuel remaining, Mission Control gave the order to land. The Eagle had successfully landed. "Hello Houston, the Eagle has landed." He heard a distant voice in response. "You made us all turn green with excitement." In the control center, everyone went crazy with joy. They jumped up from the consoles, shouted, hugged, and waved flags. Everyone well understood the most difficult stage of the flight was over. As to leave the cabin and get to the surface of the Moon, it is still much easier than landing, although it requires a lot of attention and may contain something unexpected. The entire world wanted to see a man on the Moon. For the next 5 hours, Armstrong and Aldrin helped each other to enter the spacesuits and checked if everything was okay. And then Armstrong opened the hatch and began to descend. The very next moment, he was standing on the Moon. This moment was watched by over 650 million people on television. He then said his famous phrase,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
The first step of a man was imprinted in the moon dust. A while later, a physicist, Robert Jastrow, calculated that these traces will remain for 1,000,000 years due to the lack of atmosphere. For the next couple of hours, they collected samples of the moon, rocks, and took pictures, set up several scientific instruments, and of course the very famous footage, sticking an American flag into the moon. But that wasn't all. They also put an UN flag and 156 small flags of other countries. By this they emphasized that this was a common achievement. By the way, they also installed a laser reflector. With its help it's possible to measure the distance between Moon and Earth with very high accuracy. Still, this is the simplest and most reliable argument in disputes with lunar conspiracy theory. From the Earth, you can send a laser beam to the Apollo landing site and receive its reflection in response. Finally, the USA still needed a happy ending to complete the mission. It was the time for astronauts to return home. The engines roared and the cabin slowly lifted off from the surface. In the end, the lunar module was reattached to the command module, and the 3 astronauts turned the spacecraft towards the Earth. The risk of the astronauts dying was so high that the US President Nixon had prepared an alternate speech in case if the astronauts were indeed killed. But thankfully this wasn't needed. The command module safely descended the Earth's atmosphere. The parachutes were deployed and it landed in the ocean, with all 3 astronauts alive. It was truly a miracle that they could return alive. They had to face problems at almost every step and they successfully dealt with it. Funny moment, nobody knew how space would affect people and if there were any viruses or bacteria on the moon. Therefore the astronauts were decided to isolate from the outside world and quarantine. Apollo 11 moon landing was of course at the top of news in newspapers worldwide. The US President Kennedy promise of having humans land on the moon before the decade was over was made possible by NASA. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race. 3 years after the Apollo 11 mission, December 1972, the last moon mission, Apollo 17, took place. Since then, it's been 50 years and no other person went to the moon. This only shows how expensive the Apollo program was. More than 400,000 scientists, technicians and developers worked on it, and the cost back then was $24 billion. In today's money, it's $100 billion. But now, 50 years later, NASA has a plan to send the first woman to the moon by 2025 or 2026, after which they plan to send the first person of color to the moon as well. One thing we can say for sure, by the end of this decade, we will see humans back on the moon. Let me know if you like this video. Thank you and see you soon.